It says live now.
We're live. Go ahead.
Okay. So thank you everyone for coming.
You are live. Go ahead, Sarah.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming. I know it's late in the day, the second long day, but we're really happy to have Maha coming in with us from Cairo. Maha Bali is an associate professor of practice at the Center for Learning and Teaching at the American University in Cairo. She's also the co-founder and co-director of Virtually Connecting, a volunteer movement that aims to enhance the experience and voices of educators who could not attend conferences by including them in hybrid conference conversations. She has been involved in Solia's web-based intercultural dialogues in various roles, from facilitator to coach and trainer to consultant, and currently teaches a course that integrates Solia and intercultural learning. She's on the advisory board of the Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange project and gives workshops and short courses on intercultural networked learning. Maha couldn't join us in person, but we're very pleased to have her here today. She has, maybe you can describe then Maha, but she has set up a Google Doc where you can write things, you can write questions. She'll share that link with you. And there will be several times during her presentation where if you have questions or comments, we will bring the microphone to you and you can dialogue with Maha. So I think that's it. It's over to you, Maha.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for having me. I really wish I could have been with you in Poland, but people who would be welcoming to be this group of people. To share some juggling between the slides, and I like to have interactive keynotes to you because I'm not with you. The opportunity to chat with you in coffee breaks and dinner. I'm hoping that throughout the keynote I'll be able to listen to you a little bit. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. And this is going to be a juggling act throughout as we do this. Okay. So my keynote is entitled Flipping the Script on Intercultural Learning and Other Stories. And throughout the keynote, you can use the /flip intercultural. It's a Google Doc, and it's got some questions that I'm going to ask you to sort of interact with, either in writing or using the microphone. And I have my slides up on my blog and a link to this live stream if anyone wants to see it later. The slides are commentable, so you can either comment now or later if you want. And before I start, I know you've already had at least one day of the conference, but I was wondering if you guys would like to take a minute to just when you don't know. So not the person sitting next to you who you probably know, but maybe turn around for a second and introduce yourself to someone else. I'll give you a minute to do that. If you're watching online, introduce yourself online on Twitter or something so that people online know you're watching together. That would be cool too.
She's not going to be able to stop them.
But this is good stuff.
People are introducing themselves to one another.
Okay, I hope you've all someone new, partner, maybe someone you're going to have lunch with tomorrow or stay in touch with after the conference. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again now.
Okay. You don't know what you set off there, Maha. People are happy to talk to one another.
That's good. That's definitely more fun than just listening to one person, I think. But we'll do more of it throughout the day. So, all right. So one of the things that I noticed about the theme of the conference, this focus on global citizenship and social inclusion. And I think the two intercultural things that I work with both that. And I'll talk a little bit more about virtually connecting as I go on. And so Leah, I'm assuming is familiar to a lot of you. And just connecting is a volunteer movement where what we do is we have conversations with people who are at conferences, talking to people who couldn't be at the conference. And rather than just live streaming talks, so you only know the content of the conference, you actually have those conversations. Missing out on the hallway conversations, though. You just bump into someone and have a chat about something informal that's not really planned ahead of time. And we think it both allows people who are unable to go to conferences often, so people from distant countries, people who can't financially do it, people who have young children and can't travel a lot, people who have health issues. So it's all about the social inclusion. And also because we have these really deep conversations, I think it promotes the global citizenship aspect as well. And so Leah, I'm familiar with, is web-based intercultural dialogue for students. And again, it promotes their global citizenship. And it has, again, versus, for example, traveling for international exchange, it's more inclusive because not everyone can. And so it's definitely two things that promote that. And so during this keynote, I'll be sharing stories and I want to listen to yours. And so feel free to use the Google Doc if you like using Google Docs, or if you just want to share it out loud with me, that would also be very good. And just so you know, I know it's late in the day. This keynote is not going to be academic at all, even though I am an academic. I didn't want to make it academic. And the keynote is not very coherent. So if you following, that's fine. That's not you, that's me. Sorry? I can't hear that. And the other thing is, if you're not, so it's okay if you don't focus, but hopefully you'll stay awake with it, and I'm going to be asking you. So here's the first story. It happened to me about 10 years ago when I was living in Houston in the US. Someone, minutes of meeting me, asked me, why are you not Christian? Take a minute to think about how that would feel to be asked that question. And you can either text to you or type into the document what you feel and how you might respond. I know I'm starting with a difficult one. Sort of to get us on the path, This is probably the most difficult question in the entire keynote. But I'm looking at the Google Doc now, and I just saw something really pretty by Anonymous Chipmunk. That person was saying, I have the same issues when Muslims ask me. And as that person was typing, in the beginning, they typed Muslims with an O, and then they changed that to Muslims with a U, which I think is beautiful because it showed like this awareness that using Muslims with an O versus Muslims with a U has a meaning. And so you say you have that same question Muslims ask you about atheism. That makes sense. I'm interested in that person because how do they know you're atheist straight off? I mean, people know I'm Muslim straight off because of the headscarf. And I've lived in Western countries where I wear a wool cap in winter and people don't know what's going on there. But when I wear the headscarf, that is obvious, obviously. Okay. So I'm reading the response to my question now on Google Doc, and they're saying it says on your Facebook page that you're atheist. And it's also interesting that Facebook would ask us to sort of talk about our political beliefs straight out in ways that we don't normally do when we meet people, right? Someone, your religious beliefs or your political orientation. So that's also an interesting thing. Responses I'm getting on the Google Doc, some people are saying, why should I? Like, as in, why should I be Christian? And And the question would be, why are you not, is the same. And someone would ask, why are you? That response from someone. Someone said, because of people like you. Someone said, I might be offended and try to get out of the conversation, but I might also take the bait and respond with a question, why aren't you Muslim? Okay. Does anybody have something they'd like to share out loud? I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second. Does anybody want to share a response to that out loud?
Anybody?
No pressure. Just giving time. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit more.
Oh, there is one person, Maha.
There is someone. Okay.
I have a response to the question. What I would say if someone asked me that, for example, yeah. I would say, why should I be?
Why should I be? Okay. And then, because the assumption there, I guess, is that that person is asking that question and they're trying to preach or proselytize. So by asking them that question, I think you would sort of continue that conversation. I think it sounds like an aggressive or passive aggressive response of why should I be? The context of this conversation. I was in Houston, and someone who is, I think, around, who doesn't speak very good English, was in my apartment fixing something in the sink in the kitchen. And I actually, it was this funny situation where I woke up and found him at home because I'd forgotten to lock the door, so there was no one home. So it was a pretty shocking day altogether. And when he saw me, yeah, good morning, and then he said, why are you not Christian? And my response to that was not at all like any of those things. I said, actually, I'm Muslim and we believe in Jesus too. And we have a lot of Christians in Egypt. And then after that, the conversation, we just had a really good conversation in general. And we had orange juice together and we had a good day. And it wasn't, I felt like he was asking because he was trying to save my soul, and he didn't mean it in a way that was aggressive. And I think if the person who had asked me that was someone in a power position, it would have been a very different question. And because without giving you any context, it's a question. I think in a time of Trump and white supremacy being so open in the US, if I'd got asked that question today, I would have been much more of the but I realized at that time that the way I responded to him resulted in a very different dynamic than if I'd responded otherwise. So this was one of the stories that something happened differently because of the way I responded differently to that conversation. Okay, let me share my slides again. I remembered this verse from the Quran about how all of us are created from the same male and female. So obviously Adam and Eve made into nations to know one another. This is one particular interpretation of the Quran. Someone else might read it slightly differently. But what I thought was interesting about it is that it was focusing on getting to know one another, and rather than that we proselytize or preach to one another in this verse. And it just made me think about that conversation about Christianity. Another thing that happened to me recently was I was giving a workshop about critical pedagogy to people, caseworkers or social workers who work with it. And things they talk to me about, and I don't know if this is the kind of thing that happens in other countries, but over here, a lot of people from NGOs and young people who are at university doing community service would go and visit these NGOs, would go and visit these orphanages. And they go to the children either to teach them something, help them with school, or to give them gifts, or sometimes to just play with them or bring them like a party or a concert. And I want to ask you guys how you feel about this, because the person was talking about the charitable gaze. I mean, they never said the term charitable gaze, but it made me realize she was talking about how orphans the right to invite someone. They find people coming to them at their own time. They don't get to go there, when they get to go there, how they get to interact with them. And she talked about how giving them gifts made them feel like they were different and less than other children, that if they really wanted to give them something they need, they should give it to them from far away rather than coming to them and presenting it to them. And when she talked to me about this, at the beginning, it was like, oh my God, really? And then I realized that it makes sense that that's how it would feel. And I was wondering if you guys had thoughts on how it can be done otherwise, if you've seen ways in which NGOs that want to work with marginalized groups, what are the ways that they can work with marginalized groups without making them feel further marginalized, without imposing that charitable gaze on them? And thinking about how intercultural learning experiences sometimes feel that way too. So I'll just give you a minute to also, again, talk to someone beside you about what you think of this. Feel free to type in the Google document, or if someone is willing to actually respond out loud, please let Sarah and Miriam know. Someone's writing in the Google Doc about in Haiti, people service groups come with wide eyes and make a lot of noise, then fly away. That's such a great example. One really interesting point on the Google Doc is also that often the charitable gift is meant to make the giver feel better about themselves first and foremost, and not feel guilty about possibly not doing more to actually change a given situation. And I think that's a really important point. I think when any of us engages in something like this, is to wonder whether it's about making ourselves feel good or about really meeting the needs of the other. And of course, a lot of foreign aid on the larger scale comes like that, with this apparent altruism that makes the giver feel more important, better about themselves than the receiver. Someone else was writing, opening a dialogue in which people are treated as someone who can communicate their needs. To some extent, you make them one. That's a really great point. And someone talked about listening to people, having a real conversation and sharing an activity. Seeking your reciprocity, I love that. And someone wrote, in telecollaboration or intercultural exchange, perhaps the parallel can be drawn to the favor that native speakers of English are performing for others when then you're helping them learn English with overtones. Yeah. That's another good for people who genuinely do want to help. There are not that many models to follow. I recently also saw someone who is from Africa but now lives in the West, doing projects there from students from universities going to Africa, and it's still, even when the aims are liberating, it still tends to seem colonizing and structuring it, and there are not that many models to follow to empower the recipient, or that seek reciprocity, I think. I can't wait to let the donors have the impact, see the end result. If they get to attend an event that was made possible by their donor, performing youth instruments their donation made possible, for instance. That's a good point. So that they're not maybe necessarily there to give, but maybe see the output in a way that is meaning. I love that idea, that they get to attend a concert, which is not the same as giving the thing in their hands. Someone wrote, many chairs control access quite strictly to their community, but it's still serious what access might mean. I think reflecting on your reasons for going to meet, that's a great point as well. Okay. I'm going to just check if anyone in the room wanted to share something out loud about this. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. So I have some questions to pose about intercultural encounters. Who decides the format and the rules of the encounter? Who gets invited to the encounter and under what conditions? And in what ways might those rules, formats, and conditions or invitations exclude or marginalize particular individuals or groups? Questions in theory, and they're very, I mean, I was just before this meeting in an Erasmus Virtual Exchange board meeting. And one of the things when they were setting their values is because they are funded by Erasmus, plus they have to follow European, certain European values and structures and things like that. And I was wondering, well, if they're working with South Mediterranean countries, where is the voice of the South Mediterranean countries and what values that they care about? And what are any local or regional concerns that they may have that they're not necessarily on the radar for the Europeans in the conversation. And one of the things we talked about is that, for example, freedom of speech and democracy are very different in the Southern Mediterranean countries, and that things like the kinds of risks that a student takes in speaking their mind and speaking openly in intercultural encounter are very different than someone who's coming probably from European context, unless they are a marginalized or a minority in the European context. And so thinking about when we create an intercultural encounter, who decides the rules of engagement, and how does that influence how the conversation will go for everybody? And this is a quote that resonates with me a lot, because these are two authors, and they're saying, we, the minorities, and you, the dominant, do not talk the same language. When we talk to you, we use your language, the language of your experience and your theories. We try to use it to communicate our world of experience, but since your language and your theories are inadequate in expressing our experiences, we only succeed in communicating our experiences of inclusion. We cannot talk to you in our language because you don't understand it. And this is one of the issues with talking about voice and bringing the voices of marginalized people to the center, is that on whose do those voices then get heard, and to communicate in the language that is not theirs. And this Lina Munzer is a Lebanese author who translates the words of women, Syrian refugee women, and she writes them in English. And she, like a lot of people in my position who are privileged Arabs who are able to speak English fluently, they struggle with this. And she's saying, who's the reader I'm addressing when I'm writing in English? It's not like I feel almost at home in it. Do I learn? Like any language, I know it is a tool, as available to raw beauty as it is to hegemonic violence. And I know the only way to redeem it for all of us who it marginalizes is to fight our way out of those margins and insist on being part of the text. But my English is a war wound. It is a result of the roughshod amputation of my mother tongue. And I teach students at the American University in Cairo. They are all, like me, privileged, who are native speakers of Arabic, but their English is fluent and themselves in English. And it's a struggle in this situation. And I guess people like Edward said, where you know that this language is what empowers you, this language is what allows you to have cross-cultural dialogue, it what allows you to be a global citizen. And you're also made very aware of how this puts your own native language to the back burner and how it creates a sort of a chasm between you and your fellow citizens who cannot participate in global citizenship in the same way because they do not have that privilege of language, they don't have that privilege of the internet. And what I'm going to talk about next relates to specific intercultural encounters. And I wanted to know a little bit more about your beliefs or experiences on the depth of an intercultural encounter that you can have when you live in a country different than your own versus through synchronous video versus asynchronous conversations. So I'm sure that a lot of you mainly live in your home country and collaborate with others online. And I'm sure that some of you live in different countries than your own or have lived in different countries. And I was curious about how those kinds of encounters differ from each other for you in your experience or in your students' experience. Google Doc, or if anybody wants to speak up about this, I'm curious to hear about that. And I'm sure this room especially will have a lot of experiences with this.
Can I just say, well, I'll start the conversation. The first thing that occurred to me was smells and sounds. Smells is kind of the senses that you, if you're in a country, you can get that. Whereas even with synchronous video, you don't get the smells and you don't get.
That's true.
And smells and also personal space. There's the personal space varies quite a bit from country to country, and you don't get that same sense necessarily through synchronous video.
That's very true. I mean, one of the things that I talk about a lot is I'm a really affectionate person, but I'm more physically affectionate when I meet people face to face that I've known online for a long time, because I know that this is something we don't get to do all the time. And so like hugging and touching and high-fiving and all that.
There's a comment in the back, Maha. Tim?
Yeah, sure.
Anyways, I was just going to say, actually, you just assume that something that you experience physically in country is a more powerful thing, but I'm not sure.
I can't hear very well, unfortunately.
Okay, can you hear now? No?
Better, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I was going to say that things that you experience physically in country might be a stronger sensation, but I'm not sure I accept that, because it seems to me that the awareness that what you are having or have had is an intercultural encounter is in your head rather than anywhere else, and that can happen in an ongoing conversation just as strongly sometimes as it can in a physical setting.
Mm-hmm. So if I didn't hear everything correctly, but my understanding is you're focusing on it's in our head how much aware we are of the intercultural encounter, regardless of the medium, and that it can happen face to face or online, but it's how we process it ourselves and our metacognition about what's happening there that matters.
Yes.
Anyone else?
I'm going to read out something from the Google Doc. Someone was saying in station, things are already digested or translated. The most important or deepest things are often the visceral ones that you haven't had time to reflect on or put into words. These can happen in synchronous video, though, with the advantage that it's recorded for reflection later. And someone says they teach languages, so I've always been a big promoter of the value of the year abroad. However, it will always depend on engagement. You can have that whole year with very little, yes, I agree, with very little live in the culture, but with real passion interaction. I agree, because someone could possibly go on an entire the same people that they came with. In my campus, we used to have a lot of the times the other international students rather than those, for example. And the same problem is that the Egyptians don't reach out to get to know them either, so it becomes an issue. Virtual encounters may not have the physical cues we have in real life, but it can be as meaningful, and it's possible to experience connections. I agree, and I'm sure a lot of you have had that kind of experience. I think that's probably Simon who posted a SoundCloud from early morning, which I can't remember what that was, but that might be interesting to listen to later. I like this point about the downside of physical exchange is it can work better maybe for outgoing students who can take full advantage of it, but of course people who are less outgoing might find online encounters more enriching, or they might feel more free to do that. My students last semester. Interestingly, some of my students last semester who were quite shy in class went to Solia, became really outgoing in Solia, and came back more outgoing in my class. It gave them a bit more confidence to then speak up in class. Really important point about it depends on the distance between your own culture and the culture of the country where you live, or you know, the culture, I guess, and that distance can be presented in different ways. So it can be language or culture or physical distance, and yeah, between East and West. That's a great point. So when we talk about intercultural encounters, they're not all equally complex and problematic, and they are differently complex than each other depending on, I guess, also the hybridity of the individual, right? So, for example, I come from Egypt and I grew up in Kuwait, but I've always had a Western education, even though my parents are Egyptian. And so my cultural distance from the US or UK is not really that big, given that I'm very well exposed to them, versus if I went to live in Japan or in Poland or in Nigeria, for example. So those are also important. And someone is saying you can feel lonely living in a foreign country. You probably won't feel like this in OIE. You feel more safe. In online intercultural exchange, yeah. Because I guess one of the things also is in online intercultural exchange, it is for strangers to get to know each other. In the real life situation where you're in strangers, you might try talking to the person, depends on how outgoing you are, but it's actually quite different to just go ahead and do that with no context and with no safe environment to do so. Someone wrote about embodiment, serendipity, and food, which are much more difficult to do online, definitely. Although serendipity is possible with social media, that you can come across someone sort of serendipitously, like on Twitter, but much more difficult, definitely, than face-to-face. And someone says, I think you can have intercultural experiences in various ways. I moved away from the UK to the north to go to university, and I learned a great deal about myself as well as the north. Perhaps not so possible now. When I work online with my students, I also learn a great deal about their context and their impact, and this impact of their situations. Yes. Okay. The environment being limited to the screen in the virtual world, and the eye embraces so much more. One of the interesting things about the screen is that we're used to seeing the top half of a person's body, and we never think about the rest of their body and where that goes. And you do not choose what to look at, but what people want to show you. That is true. You have so much more choice in what you show people online than face-to-face, where they might see something just because it's there. They're simulated. Okay. I am going to move on. And I'm going to talk to Solia as my students experienced it last semester, because even though I'd had a lot of experiences with Solia, my students' response to it every semester makes me learn new things. And a lot of this might not seem like new to everybody, but I had written a paper talking about how, you know, things like when students' cameras don't usually a disadvantage, that they're disadvantaged and they can't use their facial expressions, for example. And think that when people have the opportunity to use versus text, that they imagine that empowering and that gives more of an experience. This voice that they would have the opportunity to represent themselves and their background, that would be something they would want. That speaking in a language other than their own is a slight disadvantage, even if they're fluent in it. And that when facilitators have internet, big problem in a situation like Sulia because of, whether there would be structure versus no structure. But my students who preferred it when their camera wasn't working, and what was happening on the platform specifically is that the platform automatically turned bandwidth was bad. And students told me we wanted the camera to be off, and I told them, well, you could just put a sticker on anyway if you wanted to. And so that this importance of allowing the participant to choose whether they would rather use audio or text. And I have a friend who's just an introvert, and in a situation where there's a synchronous conversation, she would rather turn off her video and just text the whole time, whether or not we take that text into consideration or not. She'd rather do that, and she's not going to feel empowered by having to speak up. The other thing is that my students, after doing Sulia for 8 or 9 weeks, said, oh, we would have preferred to have pen pals. Some of them wanted to have sustained text conversations with people rather than meeting them once a week for synchronous video. And when they said that, I realized that I have a lot of relationships with people that I had one-on-one, private. Because there was, the text has fewer restrictions of time and space. And I think sometimes when we design an intercultural collaboration that's mostly based on the synchronous without giving students opportunities to do the asynchronous texting thing, then we're robbing them of an opportunity for something deeper. The issue of having a voice, my students had a problem with last semester because they were sometimes forced to represent their group, being asked to defend things like terrorism and gender issues in the Arab world. And they weren't prepared for that, and I was never really sure how to prepare them for that. And I've had encounters where complete strangers on Twitter try to ask me to defend the latest terrorist attack, and I'm not really sure why they're talking to me about that. What's it got to do with me is what a lot of Muslims feel when these things happen. And so having a voice is not always and you're being put on the spot to defend a group that you don't even feel like represents you in any way. One of the issues is, one of the good things about intercultural dialogue is that we facilitate the conversation deeply into issues that are difficult to speak to a stranger, but at the same time, also someone to ask a question that isn't really a fair question to ask of someone. And in that situation, facilitators were doing, but apparently students, because they still felt like they were put on the spot. I'm still thinking about this and how to sort of facilitate this kind of conversation where someone question like that, but that the other person doesn't feel like they're put on the spot by it. And the other thing, language other than their own, is that the students start to think of it, it's a disadvantage, but it's also a power, because in a way they know more languages usually than the other people on the other side. Something that they share sometimes with conversation that the students who don't speak Arabic or don't have. So it's kind of like we know two different cultures. And one thing that happened interestingly when facilitators had internet problems is that my students eventually said they preferred it when the facilitator had internet problems, because then they could set their own structure and take agency over the situation. Because usually if you're the facilitator and you have internet problems, you panic that, what's going to happen when you're not there. But the students actually preferred it because then they could do whatever they wanted. And what I wanted to tell them was, you could have done that while the facilitator was there. You just had to tell them that. But I think they were too shy to do that. And this is a tricky thing because lack of structure is problematic in that striving for structurelessness is deceptive, because it assumes like it's kind of like saying there's an objective news story or a value-free social science or a free economy, because nothing is really laissez-faire. smokescreen for the strong, unquestioned hegemony over others. So, for example, when my students talk about lack of structure and they liked that they got to choose what they wanted, it's possible that they all agreed on what they wanted, but it's possible that the ones who say we got what we wanted were the few who got what they wanted, but maybe the others wanted something different. And the lack of structure doesn't allow them to then stop that from happening. And so Joe Freeman is saying that this hegemony can be so easily established because the idea of structurelessness does not prevent the formation of informal structures, only formal ones. And so when we don't have the formal structures, they're not documented, they're not explicit, it doesn't mean that there's no power dynamic going on there. And even in any cross-cultural dialogue, other than the dynamics between the different cultures, there's also the gender dynamics, there's also power dynamics that come into play. I applaud the students for taking agency and feeling like they want to do what they want. I think it's also important for them to know that there is still structure even when it's not explicit. Another really interesting thing that happened with me last semester with my students, that we learned a little bit about global citizenship and we talked about it. And I was a bit concerned that we were talking about global citizenship and not local citizenship, but I saw that talking about global citizenship in class made students reflect a lot on their own local citizenship as well and the dynamic between them. And they also taught who is a globalized citizen and what does it mean that Egyptian students are very much, obviously in an American university, already very highly exposed to American culture, pop culture through television and through the internet. And so they felt like they were globalized. But then what happens to students in America? Are they not globalized in the same way, or is globalization just Americanization? And what does it mean when we come to these cross-cultural encounters in the space of a semester, and how much students from both sides learn from an encounter where we don't start out in a very egalitarian space in terms of how globalized each group is. I'm going to move on now to virtually connecting, which I co-founded a few years ago. And one of the things that I realized doing it is I lived in the US for a year and the UK for 8 months. And I still interacted with people, but I learned much more about the US and UK culture virtually over the years via encounters on Twitter, by these virtually connecting conversations, some of them happening live, but a lot of work happening in the back end in private spaces like Slack and Twitter and email. In the US for a year didn't tell me. And so when I went back to the US last year, I discovered I could have much, much deeper conversations about what was really happening in terms of race and politics in the US than I could have had when I lived there for an entire year, because in that entire year, I didn't have this sustained interaction. And the room was saying, you know, this being cognizant of the kind of encounter, and it's in your head of how deeply you can take an intercultural encounter. And I think this is one of the things I'm sure all of us are trying to let our schools and our universities and people know, that with online intercultural exchange, you can have something so much deeper than sometimes you can have face to face. And another thing, I noticed that a Unicollaboration journal, which is now open access, yay, there was an article about hospitality, and it made me think about virtually connecting. We have these conversations about digital hospitality. Like, how do you create this space that where people at a conference and people who can't be at a conference are together in the long, it's a third space. It doesn't belong to us, or it's a space where we meet together and trying to be everyone there. And that digital hospitality is always on the go, as Kate Bowles says. It's dynamic because who's in that room and what kind of hybridity they bring to it differs all the time. Keeping in mind that what may seem hostile to one of us, hostile to another, like exchange and whatever, and that happens. And be cognizant for whom these rules are threatening and for whom they are. As teach spaces in ways that reflect to sort of accommodate a variety of backgrounds of people that might find one space more valuable than another. This is my colleague Nadine Abul Magd, who had a facilitation training, and she talked about how we're in a space where you were sharing stories about sensitive topics like discrimination, prejudice, and bias, and opening up in that way, the barriers start to come down when you make the space to talk about these things. Even though you might someone for months, never talk about these deep conversations in relation. But still, remember, each one of us will not see walls that might appear to others who up them. And I think one of the things is to make room for discussing thinking about ways of modifying our practice. Think an experience will be for others, may not be, and how them to changes or to spaces in the ways that would make them more comfortable. This is almost the last thing I'm going to talk about. And this is a thing about my students this semester. We were going to do a little bit of small with students in another class that was going to be asynchronous. And we were just doing a video to introduce ourselves to them. And for some strange reason, my students decided, well, we didn't actually do this in the end, but they were considering doing a video where they stereotype themselves about being terrorists, about riding camels, about living by the pyramids. And it was one of those situations where the students were stereotyping about stereotyping. You know, they're assuming that the other students in America were going to assume these things about them, and they were trying to sort of passively, aggressively reinforce them. And I've seen this in a lot of Soliya exchanges, is that you come in and you're expecting people to stereotype you so that even when they don't, you've had years of believing that they're stereotyping you in a particular time to counter that. If folks in the room have had experiences with this or ways that they've dealt with it. So I have a question on that again in the Google Doc. People have experiences with stereotyping, about stereotyping, or how they've dealt with it. Want to talk to someone beside you or write in the Google Doc or speak out?
I'm just going to make a little housekeeping announcement here, Maha. If any of you are intending on going on one of the walks at 5, we have asked for them to wait an extra 10 minutes. So because they had planned for walks at 5 o'clock, and it's not raining now, I believe. So within the next 5 minutes, we need to wrap up so that the people who are going on the walks can leave.
Yeah, I'm nearly done, actually.
So does anyone want to make a comment about the stereotype?
I could skip. Yeah, we could just speed up this one.
Okay, why don't we do that for now? Because I think people are...
Okay, so oops. Let me just go back. Nearly done. All right. So very quickly, thinking about intercultural learning from the cognitive aspect, I was at the British Museum recently and thinking about who gets to represent our culture. And so I have a lot of problems with developing intercultural competence through the cognitive side, because we need to always be questioning who gets to represent us. And in the British Museum, I was really offended by some of the ways some of the artifacts are displayed. And I was also reminded about the importance of empathy for intercultural. And this is something I think about a lot, but Paul Bloom has a book called Against Empathy, and talk paralyzing, and how we need to think about that as well when we teach about empathy, to make sure that we don't reach that stage. I'm going to spoil one, but you could read that book. It's a children's book by Queen Rania of Jordan. And I'll skip this one as well. And I'm going to end this keynote right now. And if you have any of your own stories about flipping the script, I'd love to hear the point. And we're going to have a virtually connecting session. I'd be very happy to hear from you on email. And let me stop. I think the screen sharing has stopped, right?
The what?
The screen sharing has stopped, right? You can see my face now?
Yeah, yeah.
Great. All right. So I'm done for now. I'd be happy to take questions or comments, or if people want to join the virtual after this, we can do that too.
Okay, thank you, Maha.
Thank you.
I know most of you want to rush off, but is there anybody who wants to make a comment or a question for Maha? Okay, I think people want to run off. They planned several different walks around Krakow for people to go on. So
yes, I've heard.
Some of us will stay on for the virtually connecting, and most will go off on their walks. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna drop off this, Sarah, and send Teresa the link for the virtually connecting. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Bye.